The fastest way to lose everything is to believe you built it all alone. Madison Walker learned that lesson at exactly 9:17 on a Thursday morning, the moment 12 members of the board voted to remove her as CEO of the company she thought she controlled. I remember the sound first. Not the arguments, not the shocked gasps, just the quiet click of a fountain pen being placed on a polished walnut table. Strange what your mind holds on to when a life starts coming apart. Madison stood at the far end of the conference room, her tailored navy suit flawless, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression balanced somewhere between disbelief and outrage. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline behind her, sunlight reflecting off glass towers worth billions. For years she had stood in rooms like that, as the most powerful person present. That morning was different. "You can't do this," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Nobody answered immediately. 12 board members avoided her eyes. A few stared down at their folders. Others looked toward the man seated at the head of the table. Victor Kane, chairman of the board. 63 years old. Calm. Deliberate. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. Madison looked at him like she expected rescue. Instead, Victor folded his hands and said something that changed everything. "Actually, Madison," he replied, "Ryan already did." The room went completely still. For a second, she didn't understand what he meant. Then she did. Her face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal. The same woman who had negotiated a $100 million contract 6 months earlier suddenly looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I didn't need to be. By then, every move had already been made. Every signature had already been collected. Every decision had already been finalized. What happened that morning wasn't revenge. It was simply the last domino falling. But to understand how Madison Walker went from celebrated CEO to unemployed executive in less than 15 minutes, you need to understand where the story actually started. Because stories like this never begin in boardrooms. They begin years earlier, hidden beneath ordinary moments nobody notices. My name is Ryan Walker. I'm 44 years old, born in Ohio, raised in a middle-class family where hard work mattered more than appearances. For most of my life, I believed success was something you built quietly, one brick at a time, one relationship at a time, one promise at a time. I believed loyalty mattered. I believed marriage meant two people pulling in the same direction. Looking back, maybe that was my first mistake. 6 months before that board meeting, Madison was the most celebrated executive in the city. Business magazines featured her on their covers. Industry podcasts called her a visionary. Analysts praised her leadership. Investors couldn't stop talking about her. The company had just signed a $100 million strategic partnership that sent our stock price soaring. Headlines called it transformative. Reporters called it historic. Employees called it proof that Madison Walker was unstoppable. The celebration took place at the Grand Lakeshore Ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 3 stories high. Champagne flowed freely. Executives laughed beneath golden light. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Everywhere I looked, people wanted a photograph with my wife. She smiled for all of them. She deserved some of the attention. She had worked hard. What nobody realized was that success has a way of revealing things failure never can. When people struggle, they hide who they are. When they win, they stop hiding. That night, I stood near the back of the ballroom, holding a glass of bourbon I barely touched. Across the room, Madison stood surrounded by investors and reporters. Her smile looked brighter than I remembered. Her laugh carried farther. She looked happy, happier than she'd been in years. At the time, I thought it was because of the contract. I was wrong. What I didn't know then was that while everyone else was celebrating the biggest victory of Madison's career, she had already decided our marriage was over. And what she planned to do next would set everything else into motion. The celebration continued long after the cameras stopped flashing. People think success arrives all at once, but that is not true. Success arrives in layers. First comes recognition, then attention, then admiration. And finally, for some people, comes the dangerous belief that they no longer need the people who helped them get there. I did not see it clearly that night, but looking back, every warning sign was already standing in plain sight. The ballroom overlooked the dark waters of Lake Michigan. City lights reflected across the glass walls, turning the entire room into something that felt almost unreal. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of champagne. Investors exchanged business cards. Reporters chased quotes. Everywhere I looked, people wanted a piece of Madison's victory. I stood near a marble column watching it all unfold. Not angry, not jealous, just tired. 15 years of helping build a company teaches you how to recognize patterns. And that night, I noticed something I could not ignore. Madison never once looked for me. Not once. Earlier in our marriage, she would have crossed an entire room just to introduce me to someone important. She would have squeezed my hand beneath a table. She would have smiled when our eyes met across a crowded room. Those small things disappear long before a marriage falls apart. Most people simply do not notice them disappearing. I did. I just convinced myself they would come back. Around 9 o'clock, Brandon Pierce spotted me standing alone. Brandon was the company's chief operating officer. 47 years old. Expensive suits. Expensive watch. The kind of confidence that often comes from standing near power rather than creating it. He approached with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Ryan." He called loudly enough for several executives nearby to hear. "There you are." A few heads turned. I nodded politely. Brandon placed a hand on my shoulder like we were old friends. "Tell me something," he said. "What does it feel like watching your wife become the star while you stay comfortably retired?" Several people laughed. Nothing cruel. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of laughter people use when they think a joke is harmless. I smiled faintly. "I would not know," I said. "I have never measured life that way." More laughter followed. Brandon seemed encouraged. "Come on," he said. "You can tell us." Madison just landed $100 million. Most husbands would be bragging about it every chance they got. Before I could answer, another executive joined in. "Maybe Ryan already is. Maybe that is why he always looks so relaxed." More laughter. I noticed Madison standing 20 feet away speaking with a group of investors. She heard every word. I know she did because I saw her glance toward us. For a second I expected her to step in. I expected her to say something simple. Something respectful. Instead she smiled and turned back to her conversation. That moment stayed with me longer than any joke. Not because it embarrassed me. Because it revealed something. Respect does not disappear overnight. It fades one decision at a time. One silence at a time. Brandon raised his glass. "Well, whatever you are doing, keep doing it. Looks like Madison is carrying the team just fine." This time, even Madison laughed. Clear. Genuine. Unfiltered. The sound traveled across the room and landed harder than any insult could have. I did not react. I simply took a sip of bourbon and looked out at the city skyline. Sometimes people reveal exactly who they are when they believe they have already won. The celebration continued. Speeches followed. Awards were handed out. Madison stood on stage beneath bright lights accepting praise from investors, board members, and reporters. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. She looked confident, powerful, untouchable. And while everyone else focused on the contract, I found myself paying attention to something else entirely. The way she talked about the future. Every sentence started with the word, I. I built this. I negotiated that. I created this opportunity. I led this success. Not once did she mention the team that helped her get there. Not once did she mention the sacrifices made behind the scenes. Most people missed it. I did not. Because for the first time in 15 years, I realized Madison was no longer talking like someone building a future with her husband. She was talking like someone preparing to leave him behind. That night, after the ballroom emptied and the last limousine disappeared into the Chicago traffic, I drove home alone. Madison stayed behind for interviews. More photographs. More celebrations. The city glowed beneath a cold spring sky, and for the first time in years, the silence inside my car felt louder than the radio. People assume success changes everything overnight. The truth is simpler. Success does not create new character. It exposes the character that was already there. I reached our house just before midnight. The property sat on 2 acres outside the city, surrounded by mature oak trees and carefully maintained landscaping. 15 years earlier, when we bought the place, neither of us could afford furniture for half the rooms. We spent weekends painting walls ourselves. We assembled tables from instruction manuals spread across hardwood floors. We dreamed together. Back then, every achievement felt shared. Somewhere along the way, that changed. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked steadily. Family photographs lined the hallway. Vacations. Holidays, charity events, corporate milestones. Looking at them felt strange, almost like examining someone else's life. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the kitchen. Midnight turned into 1 in the morning. 1 became 2. Madison finally arrived home shortly after 2:30. I heard the garage door open first, then the sound of her heels crossing the tile floor. She walked into the kitchen carrying her phone, still answering messages. Her face glowed with the kind of energy people get when they believe the future belongs entirely to them. "You are still awake?" she asked casually. I nodded. "Long night." She smiled while placing her designer handbag on the counter. "Worth it." Then she looked down at her screen again. Another message. Another congratulation. Another reminder that she was now the center of attention. I watched her for a moment. Not with anger. Not even disappointment. More like curiosity. The woman standing across from me looked exactly like the person I married. Same eyes. Same voice. Same smile. Yet somehow she felt completely different. "You did well tonight," I said. She smiled. "I know." The answer surprised me. Not because it was arrogant. Because it was immediate. No hesitation. No humility. No mention of the hundreds of employees who helped make the deal happen. Just certainty. Absolute certainty. A few minutes later, she disappeared upstairs. I remained at the kitchen table staring through the dark windows overlooking the backyard. That was when memories started returning. The early years. The years nobody writes articles about. 15 years earlier, there had been no luxury office. No corporate jet. No media interviews. There was only a small rented workspace above a struggling logistics company and 2 people trying to build something that might survive. Madison had talent. I never doubted that. She was smart, driven, ambitious. But talent alone does not build companies. Systems do. Strategy does. Relationships do. Long before investors knew her name, I spent nights creating operational models that helped the company scale. I built forecasting systems, negotiation frameworks, client acquisition structures. I met with potential partners nobody else wanted to meet. Some meetings lasted 5 hours. Others led nowhere. Most people never saw that part because I preferred it that way. I never needed recognition. Results were enough. As the company grew, I stepped further into the background. Madison became the face of the organization. She was better at it. Better with cameras. Better with interviews. Better at commanding a room. Meanwhile, I focused on the things that actually kept the engine running. Looking back, that arrangement worked for years because we trusted each other. At least I thought we did. Around 3 o'clock that morning, my phone vibrated on the kitchen table. A message appeared from Victor Kane. Simple. Direct. "Congratulations on surviving another one." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Victor knew more than most people. He always had. I typed a short reply. "You noticed it too?" His response arrived less than 30 seconds later. "Success changes conversations. Be careful, Ryan. Some people stop seeing foundations once they reach the penthouse." I read that message 3 times. Then I locked my phone and stared into the darkness beyond the windows. At the time, I thought Victor was talking about business. What I did not realize was that he was warning me about my marriage. And the first real crack was closer than I imagined. The first crack did not arrive with an argument. It arrived with a calendar invitation. 3 days after the celebration, Madison canceled our anniversary dinner. 15 years of marriage reduced to a brief message sent between meetings. "Sorry, something came up." Rain check. I stared at the screen while sitting in my office overlooking downtown Chicago. Outside, traffic crawled through the afternoon rush. Inside, something felt off. Not wrong enough to start a fight. Just different. That is how most endings begin. Not with explosions. With small absences. Tiny changes people explain away because facing the truth feels harder. I told myself she was busy. The company was expanding. The new partnership required attention. Anyone in her position would be overwhelmed. The explanation sounded reasonable. The problem was that reasonable explanations kept appearing more often. 1 canceled dinner became 3. 3 became an entire month of late nights. Then came the business trips. New York, Dallas, Seattle, San Francisco. Every week seemed to bring another flight, another conference, another executive summit. Madison returned home carrying expensive gift bags and stories about industry leaders she had met. Yet somehow we spoke less than ever. The house felt larger, colder. Rooms that once felt comfortable now felt temporary, like luxury hotel suites occupied by strangers. One evening, I found myself eating dinner alone at our kitchen island while Madison sat across from me scrolling through emails. Neither of us spoke for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, I asked a simple question. How was your day? She continued typing. Productive. That was it. One word. 15 years together, and all I received was one word. I nodded and returned to my meal. Looking back, silence tells its own story. You just have to be willing to hear it. A week later, I attended a charity fundraiser with her. Hundreds of guests filled a downtown hotel ballroom. Donors, executives, politicians, the usual crowd. Madison worked the room effortlessly. She always had that ability. People gravitated toward her. Conversations seemed to open wherever she walked. I spent most of the evening speaking with investors I had known for years. Near the end of the event, I stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the river. Cool air drifted through the city. The skyline shimmered against the dark water below. That was when I overheard Brandon Pierce talking to a group of executives near the bar. Madison is operating on an entirely different level now, he said. Some people evolve. Others get left behind. Laughter followed. One executive asked if he meant me. Brandon smirked. I did not say that, but I did not say it either. More laughter. I noticed Madison standing nearby. She heard everything. Once again, she said nothing. She simply smiled into her wine glass and changed the subject. The moment lasted maybe 20 seconds. Yet it told me more than any conversation could have. Respect is measured by what people allow. Later that night, we drove home together. The city lights streaked across the windshield. Madison looked exhausted. I almost let the matter go. Almost. Then I asked quietly, "Do you think Brandon respects our marriage?" She looked surprised. What kind of question is that? A simple one. She sighed heavily. Ryan, not everything is personal. I kept my eyes on the road. It felt personal. You are overthinking it. Those 3 words settled between us like cold fog. Overthinking it. Not misunderstood. Not hurt. Not wrong. Overthinking. That answer stayed with me for days. Because the truth was I was not overthinking anything. I was finally paying attention. The following week brought another change. Madison started talking differently about the future. Not our future. Her future. Her plans. Her goals. Her vision. Every conversation became centered around what she wanted next. A larger role. More visibility. National recognition. International expansion. I listened carefully and noticed something missing. There was no us anymore. Only her. One evening while she spoke excitedly about a leadership summit in Los Angeles, I realized something uncomfortable. Madison was no longer building a life beside me. In her mind, she was already building one beyond me. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether our marriage was changing. I started asking why. The answer arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. No warning. No argument. No dramatic confrontation. Just an envelope sitting on the kitchen counter when I walked through the front door. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. I remember setting down my car keys and staring at the envelope for several seconds before picking it up. My name was typed neatly across the front. Nothing else. No handwritten note. No explanation. Just my name. I opened it slowly and found exactly what I already suspected. Divorce papers. 15 years together reduced to a stack of legal documents secured by a metal clip. Strange how something can feel both shocking and inevitable at the same time. I sat down at the kitchen island and read every page carefully. Property division. Financial disclosures. Separation terms. Everything had already been prepared. Every signature line waiting patiently for me. Every decision apparently made long before I knew the conversation had even started. The rain outside grew heavier. Water streaked across the glass like gray brushstrokes. I turned another page and noticed the filing date. 3 days earlier. Madison had already filed. She simply had not told me yet. That detail bothered me more than the paperwork itself. Not because the marriage was ending. Because the decision had been made without enough respect to warrant a conversation. Around 6 o'clock, the garage door opened. Madison stepped inside carrying her laptop bag and talking on her phone. She sounded energized. Confident. Focused. She ended the call when she saw me sitting at the island. Her eyes dropped to the documents. No surprise. No hesitation. Only acceptance. You found them, she said. I nodded. Looks that way. She set her bag down and exhaled slowly. Almost relieved. Like someone finishing a task they had been postponing. Ryan, I think this is best for both of us. The sentence felt rehearsed. Not cruel, not emotional. Rehearsed. I looked at her for a long moment. The woman standing across from me was not angry. She was not heartbroken. She was simply finished. How long have you been planning this? I asked quietly. She crossed her arms. A while. The honesty almost made me smile. At least that part was real. Why? I asked. She hesitated briefly before answering. Because we are not the same people anymore. There it was. The explanation successful people often use when they want to leave without feeling guilty. Growth. Evolution. Change. Words that sound noble from a distance. I nodded slowly. And that $100 million contract had nothing to do with it. Her expression shifted. Barely. But I saw it. That is not fair. Maybe not. Silence settled across the kitchen. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Finally, Madison spoke again. Ryan, I want more out of life. More. Such a small word. Yet it told me everything. More status. More recognition. More influence. More opportunities. Somewhere along the way, she had started viewing our marriage as something connected to an older version of herself. Something she believed she had outgrown. The strange part was that I did not feel angry. Not then. If anything, I felt clarity. The kind that arrives when confusion finally runs out of places to hide. I looked back down at the documents and flipped to the signature page. Madison seemed surprised. You are reading them already? I met her eyes. Why would I not? She blinked. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared on her face. I think she expected resistance. Questions. Negotiations. Maybe even an argument. Instead, I simply picked up a pen. Ryan. She began. Then stopped. I signed the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Each signature took less than 5 seconds. When I finished, I slid the papers back across the counter. Madison stared at them. Then at me. That is it, she asked. I leaned back in my chair. What exactly were you expecting? She did not answer. Because the truth was obvious. She expected a fight. She expected me to defend what was already gone. What she did not realize was that some battles stop mattering the moment you understand the outcome. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. Inside, 15 years officially ended with the sound of a pen being placed on a countertop. And while Madison believed she had just taken the first step toward her future, neither of us realized that another clock had already started counting down. The divorce became official 43 days later. No courtroom drama. No emotional speeches. No last-minute change of heart. Just signatures, filings, and a judge confirming what had already happened months earlier. Madison kept the house. I let her. She kept most of the public assets attached to our shared life. I let her. Friends expected me to negotiate harder. A few even called to ask if I was making a mistake. I thanked them for their concern and changed the subject. The truth was simple. Some things are not worth fighting to keep once they no longer belong to the life you want. 2 weeks after everything was finalized, I moved into a lakefront property nearly 70 miles north of the city. Quiet roads, pine trees, open water stretching toward the horizon. For the first time in years, silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. Most mornings started before sunrise. Coffee on the deck, cold air rolling across the lake, the sound of waves touching the shoreline. It gave me something I had not felt in a very long time. Clarity. Meanwhile, Madison appeared everywhere. Business magazines, industry conferences, financial news interviews. Every article seemed to tell the same story. Visionary leader, transformational executive, architect of the company's future. I read very few of them, not because they bothered me, because I already knew something the reporters did not. Success has a habit of hiding weak foundations until pressure arrives. 3 months after the divorce, my phone rang just after 8 on a Wednesday morning. Victor Kane, how are you settling in? He asked. I looked out across the lake. Peacefully. He laughed softly. That is more than I can say for Chicago. I remained quiet. Victor never called without a reason. The board is getting nervous, he said. About the contract? About everything connected to it. I took a slow sip of coffee. That was inevitable. Silence followed. The kind shared between people who understand more than they say. The $100 million partnership looked impressive from the outside. Investors loved the headline. Reporters loved the numbers. But large deals are rarely as simple as press releases make them appear. They depend on systems, processes, intellectual property, operational frameworks, relationships built over years. Most people focus on what they can see. Very few pay attention to what actually keeps the machine running. That afternoon, I drove into town and met with Olivia Brooks for lunch. Olivia had spent nearly 2 decades working in corporate law. Intelligent, precise, impossible to intimidate. She had also advised several companies connected to projects I helped build years earlier. We met at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor. After exchanging pleasantries, she opened a leather folder and slid several documents across the table. "Everything is ready," she said. I glanced at the pages without touching them. "Any surprises?" She smiled faintly. "Only for people who failed to read the agreements carefully." That answer told me everything I needed to know. Years earlier, while helping structure key parts of the company's expansion strategy, I had insisted on certain protections. Not because I expected betrayal, because responsible planning requires preparation. Some ownership rights remained separate. Certain licenses remained independent. Several strategic frameworks existed under entities completely outside the company's direct control. The board knew. The attorneys knew. A handful of investors knew. Madison never paid attention to those details because success came quickly enough that she stopped believing details mattered. Olivia closed the folder. "You still have time to stop this." I looked toward the water beyond the restaurant windows. Boats drifted across the harbor under a clear blue sky. "Stop what?" I asked. "What happens next?" I considered the question carefully, then shook my head. "I am not causing what happens next." She studied me for several seconds before nodding. Because she understood the distinction. There is a difference between revenge and consequences. Revenge requires action. Consequences arrive on their own once certain choices have been made. As summer turned into fall, reports from Chicago became increasingly difficult to ignore. Delays, internal disagreements, budget overruns, missed benchmarks, small problems at first, the kind executives dismiss during earnings calls. Yet each problem seemed connected to the same issue. Something essential was missing. And while Madison continued assuring investors that everything remained under control, a different conversation had already begun behind closed boardroom doors. A conversation that would eventually lead all the way back to her office. The first public crack appeared on a Monday morning. Financial markets opened at 9:30. By 10:15, rumors were already spreading through industry circles. A key implementation milestone connected to the partnership had been postponed. Officially, the delay was described as routine. Unofficially, people inside the company knew something was wrong. Really wrong. I learned about it while standing on the deck overlooking the lake. Autumn had arrived. The trees along the shoreline glowed with shades of gold and red. Cold air drifted across the water as I read the latest industry reports on my tablet. The headlines were careful. Analysts are always careful at first. Questions about execution. Concerns regarding scalability. Requests for additional clarification. Nobody wanted to say the obvious thing yet. The contract was beginning to wobble. 3 days later, Victor called again. His voice sounded tired. "The board spent 6 hours in meetings today." I leaned back in my chair. "That bad?" "Worse." He paused. "The partner company is asking questions Madison cannot answer." That part did not surprise me. The real engine behind the agreement had never been the contract itself. It was the operational framework supporting it. The systems, the licensing structures, the strategic architecture developed over years. Most executives focus on deals. Experienced builders focus on foundations. Foundations are invisible right up until they start failing. As October moved forward, the problems multiplied. Deadlines slipped. Forecasts changed. Investors demanded explanations. During quarterly earnings calls, Madison continued projecting confidence. She smiled. She reassured analysts. She promised strong performance ahead. But confidence has limits, especially when reality begins arriving faster than talking points. One Friday afternoon, Olivia forwarded me a public filing. I opened it and read every page carefully. Halfway through, I stopped and smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because someone was suffering, because the truth was finally catching up. The filing confirmed what I already suspected. Internal audits had discovered dependencies nobody at the executive level had fully understood. Critical intellectual property, operational rights, strategic licensing agreements, pieces of the machine that existed outside direct company ownership, pieces connected to structures created years earlier, structures everyone had ignored because everything worked perfectly when trust existed. Trust was gone now, which meant paperwork suddenly mattered. A lot. The following Tuesday, the stock price dropped 7% before lunch. Financial news networks started discussing leadership concerns. Industry bloggers began digging through old records. Former executives received calls from reporters. Questions multiplied. Answers became harder to find. Somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, Madison finally called me. The number appeared on my phone just after sunset. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Hello, Madison." Silence greeted me at first. Then her voice. Controlled. Professional. But strained. "Ryan, we need to talk." I looked across the lake where the last traces of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees. "About what?" Another pause. "There are issues." The wording almost made me laugh. Issues. Not a crisis. Not a disaster. Issues. "I have heard that," I replied. "You know more than you are saying." I remained quiet. "Ryan," she continued, "certain agreements are affecting implementation." There it was. The first acknowledgement. Not an apology. Not accountability. Just recognition that the details she once ignored had become impossible to ignore. "Those agreements have existed for years," I said calmly. Nothing changed. Her breathing slowed. "Then why is this happening now?" I watched the dark water ripple beneath the moonlight. "Because foundations only matter when people stop respecting them." Silence followed, long enough for both of us to understand what I meant. She ended the call a few minutes later without getting the answers she wanted. The next morning, another report landed on the board's desk. Then another. Then another. By the end of the month, emergency meetings became routine. Investors demanded accountability. Directors demanded explanations. And for the first time since signing the partnership, Madison Walker walked into a boardroom without certainty. What she did not know was that the most important meeting had already been scheduled. A meeting where every unanswered question would finally receive an answer. And where every person who spent years believing they understood the company would discover just how little they actually knew. The emergency board meeting began at 9 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning. Rain streaked across the glass walls of the executive conference room 32 floors above downtown Chicago. 12 board members sat around the long walnut table. Attorneys occupied one side of the room. Financial advisors occupied the other. No one smiled. No one exchanged small talk. The atmosphere felt heavy, like a storm that had finally arrived after weeks of warnings. Madison entered carrying a folder filled with reports. Her posture remained confident, but confidence and certainty are not the same thing. For the first time in months, she no longer possessed both. Brandon Pierce followed a few steps behind. His expensive suit looked flawless. His expression did not. Across the room, Victor Kane sat quietly reviewing documents. The chairman looked older than usual. Tired. Resigned. Like a man preparing to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. Madison took her seat and immediately began outlining recovery plans. Revised timelines. New projections. Alternative implementation strategies. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged her. They simply listened. When she finished, silence filled the room. Then Victor closed his folder. The sound echoed across the table. "Thank you, Madison," he said calmly. "Unfortunately, the board has already reviewed these proposals." Madison nodded. "Then you understand we can still fix this." Victor looked toward the other directors before returning his attention to her. "That is not the conclusion we reached." Something changed in her expression. Not fear. Not yet. But confusion. The kind that appears when reality begins moving in a direction you did not anticipate. One director slid a report across the table. Another added several legal documents. A third placed an audit summary beside them. The stack continued growing. Page after page. Evidence after evidence. Findings. Reviews. Compliance assessments. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Critical components supporting the partnership no longer operated under assumptions the company had relied upon for years. The board had spent weeks investigating. Now they had answers. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Madison flipped through the reports quickly. The color slowly drained from her face. "This cannot be right," she said. An attorney cleared his throat. "The findings have been independently verified." The room grew quiet again. Outside, rain continued sliding down the windows, overlooking the city skyline. Finally, Madison looked directly at Victor. "Who authorized this review?" Victor held her gaze for several seconds. then answered with complete honesty. Ryan did. The words landed like a weight dropping onto the table. Several people lowered their eyes. Others simply watched. Madison stared at him without speaking. For a moment, it looked like she had not heard correctly. Then realization appeared. Slow. Unavoidable. Ryan, she repeated quietly. Victor nodded. The strategic structures, licensing controls, operational frameworks, and governance provisions were never owned the way you believed they were. Madison looked back at the documents scattered across the table. Suddenly, every missing answer started connecting. Every delay, every audit, every question investors kept asking. The pieces formed a picture she had never bothered to examine before, because she never thought she needed to. One board member leaned forward. The company depended on systems created years ago. Systems we stopped paying attention to because they worked so well. Another director added, we confused visibility with value. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. The evidence spoke clearly enough. Victor folded his hands. The board has completed its review. Madison sat perfectly still. Across the table, Brandon looked like a man realizing the ground beneath him was not solid after all. Then Victor delivered the decision. A formal vote had already taken place. Leadership changes would be implemented immediately. Executive authority would be transferred. Oversight responsibilities would be reassigned. Madison closed her eyes briefly. Not in anger, not in disbelief. More like someone finally seeing the full cost of a decision made long ago. Months earlier, she believed she was leaving behind a man who no longer mattered to her future. Now she was discovering just how much of that future had been built by him in the first place. And while the rain continued falling beyond the glass, the board moved forward with the only decision it believed could save what remained. 3 weeks after the board meeting, the headlines finally stopped. Reporters moved on to newer stories. Investors found new companies to analyze. The endless noise that had surrounded Madison for years faded into something quieter. Reality. It was a cold November afternoon when I saw her again. The sky hung low over the lake, gray clouds stretching across the horizon. Wind pushed small waves against the shoreline, while bare branches swayed above the property. I was carrying a box of books into the house when a black sedan rolled slowly into the driveway. For a moment, I thought it might be a delivery. Then the driver's door opened. Madison stepped out alone. No assistants. No executives. No cameras. No audience. Just Madison. She looked different. Not older. Not broken. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from learning lessons nobody can teach you in advance. She walked toward me slowly and stopped several feet away. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees behind us. Somewhere along the shoreline, a gull called out across the water. Finally, she looked at me and smiled faintly. You always liked it here, she said. I nodded. I did. Another silence followed. Then she took a breath. I owe you an apology. The words hung between us. Honest. Simple. No excuses attached. I looked at her carefully. For years I imagined what this moment might feel like if it ever happened. Anger. Satisfaction. Vindication. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Peace. You do not owe me anything, I said. She shook her head. That is not true. Her eyes drifted toward the lake. I spent years believing I built everything myself. The admission sounded difficult. Not because she was lying. Because she was finally telling the truth. I convinced myself that success meant I no longer needed the people who helped me get there. I remained quiet. Some realizations deserve space. The worst part, she continued, is that I actually believed it. The wind carried a few leaves across the driveway. I watched them tumble across the pavement before disappearing into the grass. Madison laughed softly. Not from happiness. From irony. You never fought me, she said. Not during the divorce. Not afterward. Not even when everything started falling apart. I looked toward the water. There was nothing to fight. She lowered her eyes. For the first time since I met her, there was no ambition in her expression. No strategy. No performance. Just honesty. I thought I was leaving behind a chapter of my life, she said quietly. I did not realize I was walking away from the foundation of it. The words reminded me of something Victor once said. Some people stop seeing foundations once they reach the penthouse. Madison finally understood what that meant. We stood there for several more minutes talking about ordinary things. Life. Change. Regret. The future. No dramatic reconciliation. No grand speeches. Some stories do not end that way. Eventually, she glanced toward her car. I should go. I nodded. She offered one final smile. I hope you are happy, Ryan. For the first time in a long time, the answer came easily. I am. She seemed relieved to hear it. Then she returned to her car and drove away. I watched until the sedan disappeared beyond the trees. The lake remained calm. The house remained quiet. And life moved forward exactly as it was supposed to. Looking back now, I do not think this story was ever about contracts, boardrooms, money, or titles. It was about something simpler. Success can open doors. Power can create opportunities. Recognition can change how the world sees you. But none of those things replace loyalty, gratitude, or character. Those are the foundations that matter. And when people forget that, sooner or later life has a way of reminding them. As for me, I learned that losing the wrong future sometimes makes room for the right one. And I learned that peace is worth more than proving a point. Before this story ends, I would love to know your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Ryan's position? Do you think Madison truly understood her mistake in the end? Share your perspective in the comments because I always enjoy hearing different viewpoints. And if stories about resilience, difficult choices, and unexpected lessons speak to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next journey. Sometimes the most valuable stories are the ones that remind us what really matters.